Et nous allons maintenant accueillir Hans-Ulrich Obrist, que vous connaissez certainement, que j'invite à nous rejoindre pendant que je le présente. Hans-Ulrich Obrist, qui est directeur artistique des Serpentine Galleries à Londres, qui est conseiller senior à LUMA Arles. Auparavant, il était conservateur du musée d'art moderne de la ville de Paris. Depuis sa première exposition Words to Soup, The Kitchen Show en 91, il a été le curateur de plus de 350 expositions. Ses publications récentes comprennent Ways of Curating, The Age of Earthquakes, Lives of Artists, Lives of Architects, Mondialité, Somewhere Totally Else, Maria Lessing Letters, ou encore un extrêmement beau livre qui vient de sortir chez Israeli Books, qui est une interview de James Lovelock. Et je rajoute à cette présentation une manière qu'avait Peter Weibel d'introduire Hans-Ulrich Obrist en disant il y a ceux qui font du networking, ceux qui travaillent. Hans-Ulrich est l'un des rares qui fait les deux en même temps. Voilà, merci Hans.
Merci beaucoup Martin. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. I wanted to thank Maya and Vasilis and of course Marta and Maria for the invitation to do this keynote here. Also thank Arthur Fure. We're going to talk about the archive exhibitions a little bit in relation to the theme of environmentalism and environmental history with Ete Latnan and also Edouard Glissant and an outlook on Agnès Varda. And of course, we're incredibly honored and touched that Simone Fattal is with us here today. And Simone, we'll see a recording actually of Simone in the second part actually of what is now going to happen. We're also going to have several artists doing readings of Ete Latnan and have live performances. But we should give a big round of applause for the amazing Simone Fattal. I thought it was very fascinating that Grégory Quesnay talked about this idea of a jardin philosophique, a philosophic garden where many things cohabit, and that made me also think when I was listening to Philippa in terms of actually the amazing Simone Forti, whom I had the honor to visit often in LA. And I remember that this whole idea of cohabitation, of togetherness, of living together, also the idea actually of an activation on behalf of the environment was always there with LUMA from the very, very beginning. I remember, and actually Maria Finders reminded me of this very early brainstorming which Maya convened in Zurich with the core group, with Tom Eccles, Liam Gillick, Philippe Pareno, Beatrix Ruf, and many different other participants to think about a future art institution. And this idea of an activism on behalf of the environment was always there. The idea of a laboratory, the idea of a vision to never accept the status quo, the idea that in order to address these big topics, we need to go beyond the fear of pooling knowledge. And it's, of course, incredibly exciting that this happens here at the moment of the opening of this great building, which is really an experiment, an architectural experiment. I know yesterday, very often Stuart Brand was mentioned, that the building is a prediction, and every building is a prediction, and every prediction is wrong. We could also think here about two other, I think, pioneering spirits which come to my mind when I experienced the building yesterday. That's, of course, Cedric Price, who often talked about the unpredictability in relation to architecture, and the golden lion of the current extraordinary architecture biennale in Venice, Demas Navoko, a Nigerian pioneering architect who has worked a lot about many of these ideas discussed here actually at this conference, also about collective experiments and how architecture can actually address also the environmental crisis. Now, one thing which I think is important, again, it goes back to Grégory Quesnay and the amazing introduction Grégory gave on day one, that in French, ce qui est réellement nouveau dans les enjeux environnementaux et auxquels nous sommes confrontés. And I think that is something where artists play a very big role. And as Martha said in the introduction, it is about stories. And it's interesting because a few weeks ago, I spent time with the Korean-German philosopher Byung-Chul Han, one of the leading philosophers of our time, and he's working on a new book on hope. And he says that today we need a courage to tell new stories. In his own word, man muss eine andere Welt erzählen, eine andere Gesellschaft erzählen. We have to tell a different world. We have to tell a different society. Thoughts actually for a coming world Der Geist der Hoffnung, wieder die Gesellschaft der Angst. You know, a spirit of hope and against the idea of a society of fear. So I think these are thoughts which I think very much resonate with this conference and of course many of the other things which happen at LUMA. Now, I wanted to begin really with the beginnings, how it all began. I mean, it actually began earlier. It began when I was at university. I studied with Professor Binswanger, who had an amazing institute to bring ecology and economy together at university in St. Gallen. But the really main influence in terms of, I think, environmental art in Europe on me was Gustav Metzger, who is, of course, one of the really main pioneers of addressing the extinction crisis, and who, in the words of Alexis Pauling-Gams, always saw the opportunity we have as a species now to unlearn and relearn our own patterns of thinking and storytelling in a way that allows us to be actually in communion with our environment, as opposed to a dominating colonialist separation from the environment. And that, of course, is something Gustav did. I mean, we have other pioneering artists. We could think about Agnes Denes, who did this. We could think about the Harrisons. That's kind of a history of environmental art, but that would be a whole other conference, I suppose, a whole other talk. And we can see with these artists in the 60s, Gustav, Agnes, the Harrisons, that they actually kind of moved from the idea of formal concern. So it's not earth art in that sense, or not land art, because their earth was used as a sculptural material. And there was often actually still a form of extractivism at stake, but they wanted to go towards a deeper understanding of interdependent systems, processes which involved, ethical issues, social issues. And I think that whole, history of environmental art in that sense is still in big parts unwritten. I think it's extremely fascinating in that sense to revisit these pioneers now, which we did also with Agnes Denes, doing a retrospective of hers, The Shed, and doing, of course, many, many shows with Gustav before his passing. Gustav told us that our task is to remind people of the richness and complexity in nature, to protect nature as far as we can, and by doing so, art will enter new territories that are inherently creative, that are primarily for the good of the universe. Gustav also said what we want to do, what is ahead for us, is to bring together the world of the arts, to unite in having a day of art actions covering the entire country. And that's what you can see here. I mean, it goes from the idea of the living crystals, which is the artwork as a basically living organism, to hear a storytelling about extinction, inviting people to tell stories and cut out articles about extinction and create this collective artwork. Here to a whole day called Remember Nature, where he basically created, with the Serpentine, basically country-wide education project where in all schools, the theme of extinction, environmental art was discussed. Now, one thing I think which is really key also about Gustav is, he was in London and we worked with him regularly at the Serpentine, and each time we made a project with him, he came the next morning to my office and he said, don't believe that it's now done. This topic is not going to go away. We are now going to do the next thing. And that, of course, led us to put really environmental issues, ecology at the center, of the Serpentine. It led us to do general ecology. It made us also, a couple of years ago, actually, appoint with Lucia Pietro-Justi for the first time, a curator of ecology. It made, many projects. Philippa mentioned, some of them. So that is not something which has to do with events, but it's something which is deeply embedded in the DNA of the institution. That involves, an extinction marathon. It involves this already mentioned Remember Nature project. It, basically involves the shape of a circle in the mind of a fish, queer ecology, conference, many different projects, and that's of course ongoing, and we'll continue this summer with Thomas Saraceno, who is going to completely transform the Serpentine, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. General ecology is a strategic effort at the Serpentine to embed environmental subjects and methods throughout the gallery's output, but not only through the output, but also the structures and the networks, bringing together practitioners from art, design, science, literature, anthropology, and so on. So thinking ecologically both within the gallery, which are of course uniquely placed, in a park in Kensington Gardens, but also across a network of individuals and organizations. We believe that this work, has to lead to new alliances, and not only new alliances between arts organizations and maybe universities and knowledge-producing institutions, but also, in wider society with companies, with governments, and so on. So it takes a speculative as well as active stance towards embedding deep ecological principles in the everyday. So the idea also of bringing it, into society by doing projects actually where artists go outside the museum and do actually, with us, environmental campaigns. Healing is a very important aspect of that. You all certainly have seen or will see the exhibition of Christof Mauch here, an exhibition in progress, which according to Christof has not started yet, is about to evolve. And it's actually super interesting to connect this time notion of Christof to what François Hartog told us here, in relation to time. Here you see the healing project, ION, the Swiss healer Emma Kunz, and Christof developed out of ION these healing seeds, which visitors could actually use in the gallery. And then, of course, I mentioned, the idea of campaigns. We're working with artists on long-durational campaigns. Brian Eno is a very regular partner. And of course, there are lots of alliances with Client Earth and many different organizations. Here, a project about voices and sounds which disappear. We have also a poster project where artists launch posters for their project. Here is Rick Tirawani's Lynn Hirschman-Leeson, for example. Or just you can see many of those also on our website, or Sky Hopinka, whom of course you know from the exhibition also here at LUMA. So these are campaigns by artists, and I want to talk here as a case study a little bit deeper about one of them, because I think it's interesting in relation to many of the topics and many of the dimensions somehow discussed in this conference, and that is really the project of Mantia Diawara. Mantia Diawara, who developed this project actually of a film in Senegal, and I'm going to read here from his campaign, from his statement. When I bought my house, Mantia says, and he's an artist, a filmmaker, an academic, a scholar based in New York, from Mali, based in New York, and also now in Senegal. And he says, when I bought my house in 2010 in Yéné, a small fishing village on the Atlantic coast of Senegal, I didn't have any idea that it would turn me into an activist on behalf of the environment, or the ecology, or as Edouard Glissant put it, the natural surroundings. What drew me first to the house was that it stood on a savage beach with no tourists, only fishermen throwing nets into the ocean. It's easy to see why I like my house in Yéné, with its fishermen, pebble collectors, and migrant pelicans, all of whom depend on the generosity of the ocean for their livelihood. So he refers to the generosity of the ocean. For the last 10 years, I have seen rapid development in the area. Now the rainy seasons don't just bring back pelicans, they have become notorious for annual fatal floods all over Senegal, clearly the effect of climate change. Another apocalyptic scene is the rubbish that the ocean throws back on the beach. And he talks here, of course, about a specific, protagonist, about Alou Diouf, who says, it's the fault of man. You throw a ball against the wall, it will bounce back to you. And there are many other charismatic people in this film who taught Mantia about the ecology of the ocean. Martine Gomme is another one. She's focused on the pebbles, on the shells deposited by the waves in different spots at different moments of the day and at night. And he actually pointed out to her that collecting pebbles is bad for the sea. Her answer was the sea has always been generous to us. First it gave us fish, now that fish are rare, it gives us sand and pebbles that patrons like you buy from us. If you want me to stop, don't talk to me about the sea, just give me money for my time, and I'll stop it. Worlds apart, in America, Mantia says, where I work, environmental debates divide us. Here in Yéné, people are forced to abandon their traditional production and consumption habits, and in a way, the question is, how do I share with them my concerns about global warming, and they with me, the everyday hustle to earn a living without dignity. It is at this point that I find Glissant's call, and now he comes back to Glissant, who I think is so relevant for our discussion. It's at this moment that I find Glissant's call for a poetics of the ecology essential. In his critique of how land was rendered barren in Martinique by the use of chemicals to boost banana plantations, and how the population was dependent on the importation of all their products from France, Glissant asserted that what was urgently needed was a renewed sensibility toward land, not the sacred fatherland and a nationalist territory that excluded others, but a rhizomatic land that's a driving force for the relational interdependence of our lands. So that's, I think, the super important point. No, not a nationalist territory that excludes others, but a rhizomatic land. That's the driving force for a relational interdependence that forms the basis for entitlement. A reconnection, Diawara writes, with land, or as Glissant puts it, a renewed aesthetic relation to land is also a move to subvert and undermine our current consumption of standardized and packaged products. A love and poetics of land is a recognition of the unique value of every land and the solidarity between all lands. To celebrate the changing identities of each land according to seasons is to enter into complicity and admit that all lands are equal, small or large, iceberg or landmass, and each must be protected for the survival of the planet's biodiversity. End of quote. Now, what Manthya Diawara means with that is that we really need an aesthetic of solidarity. And that's really, what this film, which is part of the Back to Earth campaign, in a way, tries to address. So Glissant's idea that we act from our own location, but to think from the world, is very much at the center of that. And I think also in relation to the theme of the conference, it's interesting what Glissant says about landscape and environment, because landscape is for Glissant and also many other Caribbean writers, for Aimé Césaire, a character in a way that actually Glissant liked to say that transparency is the country of someone without landscape, no? Transparency is the country of someone without landscape. Glissant used to oppose that all the time because landscape was someone without landscape. Glissant used to actually oppose that because landscape was the most, in a way, not only environmental voice, but also a way of connecting you to the land and also to feel we are talking about trembling, to feel the trembling. So that brings us to the whole idea of the trembling land, no Glissant's kind of utopie du tremblement. So the only way we can change is through the changing of imagination. And that's, of course, also what Bernard Stiegler addressed here, very much at one of the LUMA days some years ago. I'm just going to show you a few images of last year's presentation of the archive on which we worked with Arthur Fouret here at LUMA. Here are some notes and posters from Edouard Glissant. And basically, the whole idea was to show the archive of all the conversations, and it's, of course, Glissant who brought Manthya and me together. And this is the piece, the poster by Philippe Pareno. So for those of you who want, you're all invited to call this telephone number, and Edouard Glissant will answer. So I'm going to keep it for a second so that you all can either take a screenshot or take the number. And the exhibition included, of course, also many other documents from the archive, written documents, and we now travel actually to the LUMA Westbau in Zurich in a new version, where many different artists are actually going to create new posters for the show, and that's going to open in June, so I hope you can see it all there. Yeah, and that's the window, right, with the tree and all of that, and the outlook actually and Dominique Gonzalez-Förster's ribbons, and the outlook to the next chapter of our archive project with Agnès Varda. In English, it says, "A day without seeing a tree is a wasted day." And it's, of course, interesting, that Sejima, who designed the space, insisted that Frank Gehry builds a window and that a tree is planted outside the archive room. So in a way, it all connects. Here we come back actually to Gustav Metzger's, the idea of, remember nature, because we also, together with Kostas Stasinopoulos and our Back to Earth team, wanted to gather a series of instructions and recipes. It's kind of a revisitation of an older project called Do It, where we ask artists to do how-to manuals, and we wanted to do that in relation to the environment. So all these artists participated with DIY pieces, and you can, for example, have a few examples to show you here. It's Judy Chicago, Jane Fonda, and Swoon. They created a whole movement, Create Art for Earth, basically of environmental campaigning and inviting artists with this hashtag to contribute, works, and happened during the multiple lockdowns so that people would do these works at home and then share them online in a DIY way. Olafur Eliasson's DIY piece here, which, we are all invited to do these pieces. And of course, Precious Okoyomon's garden. Precious, rather than producing exhibition, considers temporalities of garden and nature. And I think that is something which is a key shift right now, which is happening. I mean, we already evoked the idea of the living organism. I think that is something which keeps coming up a lot, the artwork as a living organism. But many artists right now are interested in rather doing gardens or farms than doing exhibitions, right? So we have Precious here. It's a DIY garden. They also did, of course, in Aspen in Colorado, the every earthly morning, the skylight touches your life in unprecedented in its beauty. So that was a garden, right? Rather than an exhibition, they built a garden for a year. Or, Baruchello, who spoke at the LUMA days, I think 2 years ago, the late Gianfranco Baruchello started a farming project in the 60s, and it's fascinating that now many contemporary artists, example would be Inka Shonibare or Ottobong Nekanga, are working with the temporality of a farm. So artworks as living organisms. Here the page from the book also from Remember Nature of Simone Fattal, whatever the bombs, whatever the threats, Earth always will give us back flowers and happiness. And we will very, very soon hear the poetry reading of Simone here. And talking about the garden, I wanted to also talk about Daisy Ginsberg's garden, which is actually an artwork for pollinators. So this is a garden we built, in Kensington Gardens. So the idea of a long-term project. I mean, I think we need to think also our whole field, and that's true for conferences, that's true for exhibitions. We need to think about ways how we can go beyond the short-termism of event culture, right? How we can Brodel's longue durée becomes more relevant than ever. How can we actually work on really long durational projects? And that, of course, sometimes means, and it's, of course, wonderful to talk about this here in the park, because the park is such a long durational project which continues to evolve of Bass Metz. And here, we are back, to Kensington Gardens for Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg's Pollinator Garden. It's a living sculpture made of plants, and unlike most gardens, it's designed to prioritize the needs of endangered pollinating insects. So the garden is not made for us humans, but it's actually made for pollinators. And it's a custom-built computer algorithm. It's also in collaboration with the Eden Project, which created a planting design to support the maximum number of pollinator species possible and available. So the pattern that emerged offers pollinators, so we think of bees, and moths, and ants, and wasps, and beetles. So it's a garden really for them, It gives them habitat, space to forage as they appear over a year, and arrangements which, suit different pollinating situation. And it uses, in that sense, technology, AI technology, to make this possible, and very much connects to UK indigenous pollinators and their vital role for the environments. The collaboration with Google Arts and Culture. Whenever you're in London, it's there. It's not going away. It's a long durational project. And of course, thinking about the artwork as a living organism, we won't have time to go into details, but here at LUMA, you all remember Pierre Week's exhibition, After Umwelt, or if you think also about Philippe Pareno's ongoing, evolving installation, these are artworks, as living organisms. So I think there's a whole thing about that. It's almost like a new ontology which is being born. We hope to see you all in London at the Serpentine this summer, because many of these topics will be discussed in the annual pavilion of Paris-based architect Lina Gottme called À Table. It's about sitting together at the table, and actually a sense of unity is what she wants in her organic design, inviting, all kinds of interaction inspired by nature and echoing the grounds and canopies, of the trees and its surroundings, which led to this design. And this pavilion very much has to do with Etel Adnan's quote, that the world needs togetherness, not separation, love, not suspicion, and a common future, not isolation. And of course, the question is always also, how can we use technology for that? How in the 21st century, where a lot of technology leads exactly to isolation and not togetherness, how can actually digital technologies foster attention to the natural worlds? How can digital technologies create new narratives about our ecological futures? How, and that's, it leads us back to my favorite quote, and I like it so much that I want to read it twice in this talk, which is Alexis Pauline Gumb's quote, right? We have the opportunity now, and with that, of course, she refers to technology. We have the opportunity now, as a species, fully in touch with each other, right, with all these devices. We do have the opportunity to unlearn and relearn our own patterns of thinking and storytelling in a way that allows us to be actually in communion with our environment, as opposed to a dominating colonialist separation from the environment. And that, of course, leads us also to video games, no? That is a huge potential we see now with video games, something Jakub talks about. So many video games now. We have surreal games, we have social advocacy games, we have non-documentary games, poetic games, indie games, mobile games, but we also have mission-driven games. We have ecological games, and that's, of course, Jakub is very much part of that, and I'm doing a show in Düsseldorf, which at JCC, which is now going actually to Metz, to the Pompidou du Summer, which is all about that, which is about basically how games can be used through artists in many different ways. And here another example of Jakub. There was a collaboration with BTS in London, the K-pop band BTS, which addressed basically this idea of deep ecology. It was very much connected to Arne Næss, the idea of deep ecology, but also just simply the idea of a forest. And then the Institute of Queer Ecology. The Institute of Queer Ecology would be an example for how a new generation of artists would actually work on technological projects that prioritize, I never can say this word in English, that prioritize togetherness in a biodiverse world, right? So guided by queer and feminist theories and decolonial thinking, the Institute for Queer Ecology uses gaming exactly for that. So I think that's definitely something which will play a very central role in the future. How can we use technology not in the way it's mostly used today? How can artists actually bring us to use it in a different way? In the way Etel Adnan said, how can we have togetherness, not separation, love, not suspicion, a common future, not isolation? Something also that Turbo Abidon, is working on here with the permanent sunset, or something Kushong is doing with augmented reality, with this prerequisite work, which is the AR ice cube. And this is now the transition, really, the quote about togetherness, not separation, love, not suspicion, a common future, brings us to the late Etel Adnan, one of the greatest poets and artists of our time, whose work has been a huge inspiration for me over many, many years. And like Paul Klee, Etel Adnan was a polymath. The practice could be linked actually almost to superstring theory. It's a Gesamtkunstwerk, which involves cartographies, drawings, films, notebooks, novels, paintings, plays, poems, political journalism, tapestries, teaching. It's an incomplete list, right, to be continued. There are so many dimensions to Etel's work. Born in Beirut in 1925, Etel studied actually at the Sorbonne and Harvard, then taught philosophy, started painting in the 50s in California. And no one writes more beautifully about Etel's work than Simone Fattal, who describes Etel's paintings exuding energy and giving energy. They shield you, Simone says, like talismans. And in a way, that's, of course, referring to the amazing small paintings of Etel, which you can also see here at LUMA. There are many different projects. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes, actually, with Maya and also Vasilis. Many projects Etel did here at LUMA Arles. What is also, I think, super important in relation to Etel's work is, of course, this in a way, Glissantian, activism of the environment, because very often, particularly in her last cycle of poems, this played such an important role. And I kind of gathered them in a book, actually, these very, important last cycle, season, mer et brouillard, sea and fog, night, search, and also displaced the silence, déplacé le silence. And they are really, in a way, an epiphany. They are the accomplishment of, many, many decades of Etel's amazing work. And obviously, as you all know, Etel never wrote a bad line, as a great poet once said. So one could really pick out almost any sentence, but these cycles are particularly extraordinary. And they're very relevant for a conference on, environmental history, because very much connecting to meditations on nature, connecting also in a way, to how we connect with each other, with the environment, and I think that maybe it's good to mention a few of these cycles. I mean, in Déplacer le silence, which is actually one of Etel's very last texts, Etel talks about very much about life and death, but talks about, in a very intimate way, about the outside, about basically the climate disaster, about forests, about fires in California, about wars, connecting also, like often in her work, you know, the environmental extinction to war. She always told me that war is one, you know, of the worst extinctions. And we felt it would be very important actually here towards the end of the exhibition of Etel and in the context of this conference to pay homage to Etel and to do this in different ways. So we're going to have readings, we're going to have also live performances. But before doing that, we're now going to give a short introduction. But thank you all so much for your attention. Thanks a lot.